Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me. We talk about faith and politics and all kinds of topics that really matter in our culture. So if you're tired of all the screamers out there taking all the oxygen out of the room and you want to join us in taking some of that space back, you'll love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and so grateful to have a place to talk about religion and politics and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished folks of goodwill in good faith. And I'm really excited to announce that it's easier than ever to find us and join our community and perhaps support us. And that's on politicsandreligion.us. The and, A-N-D is spelled out actually, politicsandreligion.us. Check it out. And that'll really help us continue to have conversations like the one we're having today with our renowned guest, Josh Good. Josh Good is the director of Faith Angle Forum, a program of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which aims to strengthen reporting and commentary on how religious believers, religious convictions, and religiously grounded moral arguments affect American politics and public life. Josh Good, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm well, Corey. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to catch up on the phone a few weeks back, and I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's great. So I want to start, if you could tell us a little bit about Michael Cromartie and the founding of Faith Angle Forum.
You bet. It started in 1999 when this kind of legend, just a friend to many around town in DC, he worked at the same think tank for 35 years, graduate of Covenant College and a master's program.
Wait, did anything good come out of Covenant College?
He was our legend hero. He taught a class that I actually took when I was a junior on Christianity and politics. And that helped me kind of acclimate to coming to DC as well. I actually worked at EPPC in 1998 and 99 for its president when Mike was there. But like 4 years after that, actually 1999, just the next year, Mike was taking a call from a journalist like a regular day. He ran a evangelicals and civic life program and ran conferences of various kinds through the many years. But he got a call from a journalist who said, okay, so you're saying something about Southern Baptists are rethinking their definitions about gender somehow, men and women. You said the book was Ephesians that you were commenting on that we should get. He said, who's the publisher? Where do I get a copy? And Mike said, oh my gosh, this has got to be an opportunity here. And famous pieces were written about how, Christians in America or evangelicals in America were ignorant and easy to command, famous stories that sort of made it seem like there was some kind of a gulf, some kind of a gap. And in short, in some conversations with a guy at Pew, Luis Lugo, the idea came to sort of start for 10 years, these regular twice a year forums up in Maine to go deep with a scholar or a cleric of religion, in a group of 20 or so journalists, and not a little sort of lunch hour conference, but a 2-day deep dive into religious faith, into sort of sociology of religion, into what the reality of Catholic vote looked like, or evangelicals in America were wrestling with. And they did for a decade. And then the funding sort of changed / dried up. And he had to build it all again from scratch, just with friends and with other foundations, be really scrappy. And Mike, if you knew him, was just he was full of life. He was always buoyant in energy. He was a hustler, and he did it. And he got it up again to build essentially once a year, sometimes twice a year forums, mostly in Miami, and carried that on for another maybe it was about 7 or 8 more years until he died all too early in 2017 of cancer. And then Pete Weiner ran it for a year, and then I came in a year after that to take over. And we've been growing the work that Mike really created ever since.
Big shoes to fill, it sounds like.
Special. He was amazing. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We like to think he's hearing this podcast and smiling. I hope he is.
Yeah, there's a great video on the website, a tribute to him. And just every picture is, one smile after another. I could tell it pours out of the screen. I think the word that David Brooks used was ebullient or something like. I think that's right. But just a cup overflowing with life.
We had an event today, Corey, with Francis Collins and Pete Weiner and Deb Harsma of BioLogos. And one of the journalists in that event was Carl Cannon. And Carl had this great story about Mike, a piece he wrote actually when Mike died. And he basically reflected, I don't think in retrospect that I can ever remember a conversation with Mike where he didn't smile. It was a way of life for him.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you about that. So you had one and the recording is being released. So this recording will be released, whether it's Monday, I think that's the 7th or the 14th, but you have all kinds of events like this. Today's event was with Peter Weiner and who else was there? There were a couple of folks that were involved.
Yes. Of the Atlantic and New York Times and a fellow here. And then Dr. Francis Collins, the outgoing director of the NIH and also the Human Genome Project director, just incredible life, just retired about a month and a half ago. Yeah. So this was one of his early events to do quietly with a group of journalists, but agreed to do it publicly and had some really interesting things to say about COVID and about, the faith pieces of that and his own evangelical community not engaging with the vaccine like he thought they would, and the pain of that, as well as the joy of eventually getting there. And Deb Hartzman, and we had about 12 journalists who were on the phone as well, or on the Zoom call. So Mona Charon from the Bulwark, Will Salatin, who just jumped over to there, John Ward of Yahoo News, and Carl Cannon, and a number of others. I'm happy to give the whole list.
Those sound like really inspiring and thought-provoking panels, lots of discussions. Are these types of events the kinds of things that you're having throughout the year, or is it just the twice a year big forum that you have?
Yeah, so we've basically tried to keep momentum with what Mike got going, twice a year forums in Miami, but we've built a few new things as well. We hired a full-time staffer last June, and so we have a conference in Europe now for the first time. We've done 2 of those. And David often will say it feels like Faith Angle at the beginning, because none of the journalists over there are thinking about religion at all. Like what your podcast is introducing a lot of us to, better, nuanced, thicker, truer stories if religion is always in the room. So that's new. We have a forum called the Michael Cromartie Forum in Mike's honor for young journalists now once a year, under 35 reporters and emerging young columnists who are just getting going in their career, but have a lot of promise. And we'll bring them to DC and let them mix with a lot of the journalists who are more senior. And then we've started a new forum in Napa to try to support West Coast journalists who have a hard time flying for 2 days to Miami.
We have had a number of really renowned journalists on our program, and we've done that on purpose because I believe that journalism or mainstream media, it gets a bad rap. It's really easy and kind of lazy to demonize what's happening in the media in general. But I think there's great journalism happening in our midst, and we just need to celebrate that. So that's a problem that we identified, and one of the main reasons that we bring on these great journalists. What are some of the problems? Can you summarize or diagnose some of the problems in our culture that Faith Angle Forum is trying to address?
Well, that's generous. I think, maybe easiest to do it with story or two. Another journalist that's on our advisory council is called Mike Gerson, who is, of course, Bush's chief speechwriter. Yeah, and your listeners will probably be familiar.
Writes for the Post. He's one of my favorites.
Yes, isn't he great? So, and publicly is battling cancer right now, so could use our collective prayers. He's in a tough spot, but an incredible output, and was served the country and significantly involved in PEPFAR. Anyway, Mike tells us a great story about being on the campaign trail with then Governor Bush in, I think it was 1999. And apparently the president made a comment, made a comment saying, I don't really want to focus on the speck in my brother's eye when there could be a log in my own eye. And the New York Times reporter who was, covering said, we understand that to be some variation of the old phrase about the pot calling the kettle black. Yeah. It's like, well, that's not actually what it was, And actually, Today, still, even if it slid an institutional membership down from 70% to 51%, 50%, who have an institutional relationship with a local church, it's still a very religious country. And yet journalists tend to not appreciate what the mainstream American in the pews or the heartland, especially coastal elite journalists, are identifying with. And so the idea is, is there some way to make headway on that? Rick Warren similarly, sold that book, The Purpose-Driven Life, years ago. Yeah. And he came to a Faith Angle forum. And actually, this is a Carl Cannon story also. He said basically like, I had to sell 18 million books before I finally got my first review in an American major mainstream newspaper. I just didn't touch it because, it seemed like so different. Stories again are told of, the Pope's burial, John Paul II's, and this idea that there was a crow's ear there.
Oh, right.
Except of course, really it's supposed to be a crozier, the staff that
right.
But it got through the editorial, there are times it was published, and all kinds of other corrections like that. Jesus is buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was buried, is buried. There's just many, many evidences of just sort of foibles that people can make. And the line sort of coming out of some reflection on this was just like, there's a gulf, right, between the way sometimes we as mainstream reporters cover things quickly. We got a lot of things going on. There's economic pressures. And sometimes we get alienated. I have a quote from a guy at the St. Petersburg Times, Roy Peter Clark, who says, "I'm just now taking seriously the theory that we mainstream journalists are different from mainstream America. We are alienated. And my own blind spots all too easily blot out religious Americans. Unfortunately, that makes me less of a citizen and less of a journalist." So it's that gulf.
Yeah. You quote Peter Berger. There's a chapter that you wrote for, is it Rutledge or Routledge?
I think it's Rutledge. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Rutledge Handbook of Religious Literacy, Pluralism, and Global Engagement. And Peter Berger, later in his life, he said in 2014, modernity does not necessarily produce secularity. It necessarily produces pluralism, by which I mean the coexistence in the same society of different worldviews and value systems. So more broadly speaking, in our culture, that seems to be a counterintuitive observation if we're to take much of what's being written and said in respected outlets today, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, and it's so interesting, right? Like, here's a sociologist who, taught for north of 4 decades at Boston University, extremely entrenched, thoughtful, prolific scholar, plus 50 plus books. And he basically said halfway through his career, I was wrong. I thought the creation of wealth, economic advancement, being part of sort of Western societies where prosperity is rising was going to lead to less religion. And it hasn't, or it certainly hasn't in America. And maybe it will, it may in the future, but it certainly hasn't. And so what we need to kind of get comfortable with is, not Marx's prediction that it'll wither away, but instead that it will maybe just take varied forms. And we don't necessarily need to be threatened by that. It may be the case that if we have vibrant, plural religion and great religious diversity, and as I see it, Jewish schools and evangelical Protestant schools, Catholic schools, Muslim schools of various kinds, maybe, religious publicly funded radio stations as well, of various kinds, that allow for incredible growth and organic cultivation of deeper belief, will have better societies. People who have thicker religious roots a lot of times are much better in the public square than those who do away with it in order to be somehow neutral, like the French. And that's a big deal right now with all the problems that you guys we're all wrestling with that are part of this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. In that same chapter, you say sometimes religious activity of any kind is categorized by elite journalists as right wing, regardless of its goals. But I did want to, I alluded to this before. I did want to ask you, isn't it also true that many of our friends in the church automatically characterize the entirety of the MSM, like I said before, as left wing or leftists? What do you think about that? And are you engaging in that mindset as well?
Yeah, I mean, Sure, that's common narrative, and yet, any of us who has cable television and can thumb through the channels will know that you can find MSNBC and CNN, and you can find the Wall Street Journal and Fox. There's not as if there's sort of one singular tilt. I don't know. I think the mainstream media, getting to know more journalists, I'm sure I'm biased, but it did pretty well in navigating the reality of COVID. I'm just thinking about that today, in terms of reporting on numbers, on what the vaccine is and does. It's certainly not fixed at all. And there are definitely institutions that have questioned what's written, but I think it does pretty well. I mean, to me, it's more like, that line from Tim Keller has talked a lot about in recent years that a lot of us are spending a lot of time inside of certain feedback loops, and churches have struggled to keep up with that pace, right? I think his line was that most Christians are just nowhere nearly as deeply immersed in scripture and theology as in their social media bubbles, newsfeed bubbles. And that may be, for woke evangelicals who are just as much influenced by MSNBC and liberal Twitter. And for conservative Christians, it's just as much, influenced by Fox News and their particular loops. But they're both living in these things 10, 8 hours a day, whereas they go to church once a week, and they're just not immersed in the kinds of, Christian worldview or biblical study that would be necessary to wisely sift those particular loops, feedback loops. That's a problem.
Yeah. And a scholar from Duke Divinity School pointed out on your podcast just recently that there are folks who don't even go to church that do have religious experiences. Going to a Trump rally is a religious experience, and wearing the hat and cheering there. There's participation in that. There's the same impulses in us as humans that folks would go to church for, and it's replacing that. That's why someone who never darkens the door of a church might identify as an evangelical nowadays. There have been some studies about that. I do want to back up for a second here, though. I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. You're a Wisconsin transplant?
Oh, most recently, we went out to Wisconsin to work in philanthropy with a big family foundation out there. And my old boss was fond of saying, if you work for a big family foundation and you get to know one family foundation, remember, one family foundation. You don't know anything about other family foundations. So it was kind of like that a little bit. It was a great team of 29 of us, billion-dollar foundation that was working with seminaries and churches and pastors as in part of what they do, K-12 character formation, and also work with engineering schools and engineering faculty. But it was an engineer who was the son of an itinerant preacher from Iowa. Just a delightful human being, 96 years old now, to work for. And we also started a K-8 Christian school out there. And then we came back to DC. We've lived here 12 of the last 20 years. So we missed it. We missed our friends. We missed the pace, the energy. It's been really a joy to come back 3 years ago. But we were in Wisconsin for 4 years.
So we talked about Covenant College, studied history there?
I did. Yes.
And then you went to, you got your master's at a little known school called Harvard. But in all seriousness, you studied Christianity and culture. So it seems like this intersection has been a focus of yours from the get-go.
That's very generous of you to name. I think that's true. The intersection between religion and politics, between Christianity and culture, between Christianity and politics. Yeah, I worked in think tanks for 2 years, again, thanks to Mike, right after college. Had rich experiences in that and lived in Christian community around Capitol Hill and have stayed involved with that little house. I'm on the board now. I love this city. I love its energy and the fact that it pulls from so many different parts of the country, and that people who come here, they very quickly are ready to practice hospitality and hang out together and go deep fast, because they may not only be here for a year or two. They're trying to change the world really fast. Most people don't stay. If you do stay, if you're what do they call it, a marathoner rather than a sprinter, then you can often do a lot of quiet good over time and be part of longer term friendships that can be really rich. So we love getting to raise our kids here. Hope to stay here for at least the next couple of decades. Great.
Now, last time we talked, you had this great I had bookshelf envy, or library collection envy. Who are some of the scholars, whether it was your time at Harvard or some of your reading later on or now, that really have influenced your thinking, specifically at this intersection? of politics and faith, politics and religion?
Appreciate that. Kuyper, of course, is one. Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch neo-Calvinist prime minister who founded a newspaper and helped start a political party and founded the Free University in Amsterdam. He's one, and he has this idea about, thick pluralism or equitable public pluralism, confessional pluralism, structural pluralism as an anchor for how we think about what we're all up to. And I read for every podcast that we do the person's book. So that's just a great, it's really, really quite fun. A number of the journalists who are involved in Faith Angle's work, like I'd read them anyway, you'd probably read them anyway, Corey, so, to read, David Brooks's book, The Second Mountain, cover to cover.
I've mentioned it on this podcast before, and you and I talked a little bit about it before, but that was one of the most impactful books I've read over the last 3 or 4 years easily. And there are some writers, and his column in the Times is like this too. There are some writers who have a knack for, or thinkers, I should say, who have a knack for articulating things that have ingredients that are rumbling around in my brain and my soul. And they're able to bring some order to that and articulation to that to help me understand my own thoughts better. Brooks has such a knack for it. And folks that are involved with Faith Angle Forum, I mean, one after the other. And you've mentioned a few, Michael Gerson. There are folks speaking at the event coming up in April. Kristen, is it Dumais or Dumais?
Dumais, yes, right.
And Gergen. Like these are my go-tos. It's amazing. At the very least, you guys have great taste in intelligentsia.
Well, we love that intelligentsia, and getting to be around them, of course, is a huge privilege. And, I think the project exists because, as we've all learned during the pandemic, nobody flourishes in isolation. Nobody really advances the best writing. Maybe they do some, but if they're truly introverted, but the power of a group, the power of community is just where it's at. It's such a privilege for people to relate, frequently with one another who pull you up. And I think, some of the friendships that exist within several of the people you've just mentioned as well, on a regular basis, will pull them up and strengthen and equip and encourage you to do better and push harder. And so I think that's at work in the midst of Faith Angle. And we have some advisors to thank for that. Those kinds of friendships and dinner groups that like inklings keep you growing.
Did I send you the link to that book that I read on the Inklings?
You did. Can't wait for that. I haven't read it yet, but yes.
Oh man, it's a guy. I love in my imagination going into those pubs that Tolkien and Lewis and their colleagues were sitting around, and in my imagination sharing a Guinness or whatever it was that they were drinking with them. It's I love that stuff. I love but even doing it among ourselves. I got to hang out with some friends last night, which is something we can't take for granted, actually hanging out with friends, and just folks talking shop and talking big ideas. It's really a gift, man. It's really a gift. One of the things I really appreciate the more I've learned about Faith Angle Forum is you're really an advocate for great writers and great thinking. But there have been obstacles in the business of journalism, not just 20 in this year, but over the last, say, 20 years. Can you help us understand some of those obstacles?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, right. Local journalism is drying up bad, and there have been hundreds of papers in the last 10 years, and thousands of subscriptions, certainly, but have gone away, and that cheapens, it lessens the capacity to understand what's going on in the local school board, in local city council, in local. Just even recreational activities, we're not as connected as a result. And if you nationalize everything, which is what we've sort of trended toward, you really do hollow out some of the thicker civil society and middle that's so important. If you make it all philanthropic, that's okay if you can make that work. But again, that sort of hollowing out of economically interested and invested readers, and a little thicker community, you lose a sense of ownership, and that's a big problem, of course, right? So yeah, that's one piece of it. I mean, obviously, a lot of the tech has allowed. The Bandito machine is famous, the Washington Post. You instantly know how many readers you have. for a general particular article. You immediately see it. And so if you write about foreign policy, guess what? You have less than 100 readers. If you write about something that's woke, you put critical race theory in the title, guess what? You've got big numbers, and that's good for you and for your platform. So that's a problem. People just writing to what is sort of sexy that day and week or the moment, cultural moment. A lot of things have been challenging in journalism. And I think also, there are certain outlets, Atlantic comes to mind, others, who have done very well and figured out a way to get philanthropic support and hire literally, I think Jeff's hired, north of 100 full-time writers in the last 2 years. It's just incredible. They've really, really grown and have a good growing reach. The Times is growing, but it's the big papers, as you say, not the local middle of the country papers that are the ones that are sort of thriving right now. And that poses a real problem for the heartland, the middle, the smaller local outlets where we actually, need to know what's going on and should want to fix that.
Yeah, you said at one point, broad stories with broad appeal are valued more than particular pieces catering to distinct, in this case, specifically religious audiences. I'd like to think, though, that the democratization of some of these platforms, whether it's for writers like Substack or, in the media, the podcasting in general, allows us to identify more narrowcast or even microcast audiences for specific types of conversations to be had. And, someone like me might not be able to, or Faith Angle Forum might not be able to put, what's his name? The guy that got banned from YouTube that said that the shooting in Sandy Hook didn't really happen. You might not be able to put a guy like that out of business, but maybe someone spending 1% of their time or 10% of their time listening to more edifying material like the material that you put out at Faith Angle Forum.
No, it's a great word. And it's why genuinely, because new trees are blossoming and, right, like being planted and emerging. Andrew Sullivan has just flourished to leave New York Magazine and actually start his own thing. And he's, making twice the salary that he used to be making, and his supporters are actually being able to read him for him and what he really wants to say at twice the rate. And same thing with talking religion and politics without killing each other. If it's a distinct niche, if it's a gift, man, support it, Patreon or whatever else it is.
Yeah.
But the idea is let the thing really grow if it's a value.
So what might you say to a skeptic who would accuse you or Faith Angle Forum of using the objective of nurturing religious literacy among media executives and journalists as more of a Trojan horse to smuggle in something more explicitly evangelical or proselytizing tactics?
Yeah, I mean, our project really isn't about that. It's not. We're not interested in trying to make people become Christians or make people become conservative or anything like that. We're not. It's about conviction that society is better off when we appreciate that religion is always in the room, and that journalists are better journalists when they can report on the realities that are shaping people's lives. And that certainly involves religion. It's not just, and we, the idea that we could somehow make our friend Will Salatin, for example, who's moving around right now, become conservative because of, our conferences having the right entree, is just silly. It's just laughable. I mean, these are people that are too respectable to change their political minds or their, religious affiliation. Every once in a while, I mean, to be fair, it will be the case that somebody will move religiously, but that's the exception, not the rule. There is one story that I was told by Mike's widow about a journalist at a progressive outlet, and she heard Tim Keller speak, I think in 2013, and she basically came back to DC. She typed in Tim Keller Church DC, click, and found one that was affiliated with Redeemer Pres in New York, where he started a church years ago. It's called Grace DC. She started going. 5 months later, she actually decides she's going to become a Christian believer.
Oh, wow.
So that was a neat story. And she's fostering some kids now. She's doing amazing stuff. But that is the exception. That is downstream. That is not the purpose of Faith Angle. The purpose of Faith Angle is helping mainstream journalists better understand religion, period.
Have you met with, in your job, since you've been there, about 3 or 4 years now?
right? 3.5 years.
Yeah. So have you met with resistance from certain journalists or publications? And what were those objections?
I mean, people can just vote with their feet. I feel like we have dinner parties, we have lunch gatherings and invite people to come over. And if they want to come over, they come over. If they don't want to come over, they don't come over. So it's not a big deal. As long as we can get a good party of 20 people or so each time, it's our goal. Ideally, people that have some reach and a bright, flourishing career and life ahead of them, then we're succeeding. So, I mean, I can think of maybe some journalists that we've invited to forums who haven't come. But mostly, honestly, that's the case because they're broadcast journalists and they can't get away, or they just got their own show nightly. And so it's just not practical to take 48 hours away. And that's okay. That's great. We're for them too.
So I come from a New York Jewish family, so I'd be grinding my teeth the whole time about the one person who didn't come. Damn it.
It's easy to burn energy, but you run out of energy before you know it.
No, that's why I'm going to therapy and trying to learn how to do meditation.
Yes. My father is a marriage and family therapist, so that's every once in a while I get to pull out some of his skills as best I can and mess them up, but give them to people who are wrestling through this or that.
Oh, that's right. Your parents had a similar vocational line that my parents. My dad was a guidance counselor, learned therapy and stuff like that. My mother was a lifelong teacher in New York. So your mother was a teacher too, right?
Yes, German and French. Yes.
How about that? Do you speak French?
I do speak French. I get to use it as with broken, effort in France when we go over there. But I've lost a lot of it, of course.
I only remember paragraphs from Le Petit Prince. Je chasse les poules, les hommes me chassent. But if I went there, I think I'd probably pick it back up pretty quickly. But
we did have the joy in this room of having a conversation with Bernard Henri Lévy and Ed Luce of Financial Times, but BHL, as they call him, the philosopher, who's French and always has his button down here, mostly exposed. He's inherited some money from his father, a timber company creator. A fascinating guy who's done 20 plus books. Anyway, and he said a number of things in French. I was trying my best to keep up.
Yeah, that's awesome. So beyond the work of Faith Angle Forum, what other strides are you seeing in individual reporting or journalism more broadly toward religious literacy and reporting on religion and outlets like the ones that you work with, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal?
Well, I do think in the last 20 years, and I don't know how much of the credit goes to Mike and other friends, but a lot of the bigger papers have a religion reporter or two full-time now. I think I'm trying to remember. I think it was maybe 01, 02, something like that the Washington Post went first to do that. And now today there, Michelle Borstein and Sarah Pulliam Bailey, and sometimes Julie Zausmer, she's doing different things, are full-time on religion. And they do a good job. Sarah's an evangelical Christian. Michelle brings her own story, including cancer survivor and religious heritage to the job as well. Julie is Jewish, Harvard grad, but same is true at New York Times. Ruth Graham, who's a Wheaton College alum, is there just hitting away steadily on stories. Used to be at Slate. Elizabeth Diaz, also a Wheaton grad, is there hitting away. And there was this great line that the Dean Baquet from the New York Times, the editorial page, the editorial executive of the New York Times, basically said, I missed it. We missed it. We have misunderstood what happened in 2016. And I think I get it a little more so because I'm religious, because I'm Catholic. I'm from New Orleans. And effectively, we need to do a better job understanding religion and the religious roots if we're going to tell the story the right way. We've got some real atoning to do, some real work to do. And his quote is even more precise than that. But they're a great example. There are others as well. Kelsey Dallas in Utah, writing for Deseret News, is a full-time religion reporter there. So in other words, the papers have hired religion reporters, and, religion reporters themselves, I think, have increasingly been invited to be a little bit less sort of just objective neutral, just the facts, a little bit less generic story that could be cold, written by, a computer, and to draw a little bit more story and narrative, innuendo in, as part of their own reporting now. And I think all of that has worked for the better. And a lot of the mainstream journalists who have come to Faith Angle over the years, the light goes on quietly sometimes, and they start to see more religion at work in society and tell the story softly and just little hues.
Yeah. It is really encouraging when in watching some of those videos to see some of those reporters that are involved in the conversations that you're having. And it's more, even if it's something more subtle, like by osmosis, they're picking up on a language, if you will, becoming more conversant in the language of folks who are religious, and it's to your point, it's not just Christianity. I think the forum in April is including emerging trends in Jewish life and religion. There are folks, Muslim background. It really is. Actually, that reminds me, I came across this wonderful phrase I forget if you wrote it or if it's on the website, covenantal pluralism. Can you describe what is covenantal pluralism?
Well, the credit for that goes to Chris Seipel, the son of the World Vision president, Bob Seipel, and the founder of the Institute for Global Engagement, who's just a wonderful guy, just a friend to a bunch of people in DC, especially those who do work in religious freedom. And he gave a lecture by that title in Philadelphia 5 or 6 years ago. And just as a gem, just a connector. Hey, here's somebody you might think about as a speaker. And we'd love to get him as a speaker sometime too. But Chris Seipel gave a lecture by that topic and wrote the first chapter in that book from Routledge Press that you mentioned earlier about covenantal pluralism, along with a guy named Chris Stewart at the Templeton Religion Trust. And I think the basic idea is that the world is a really religious place. You got, roughly speaking, 1.9 billion Muslims in the world and 2.3 billion Christians in the world. That doesn't get you to 7, but it gets you close, And so we got to figure out a way to work together and work with each other and not be threatened by others' religion. And that's a big part of how we'll actually make it in the 21st century.
Yeah, being able to have conversations across our differences and even celebrate our differences. What a virtue to aspire towards. I'm still curious a little bit more about your own formation. When did you start to ask big questions or start to form your philosophical questions and points of view?
Probably in college. I mean, I played soccer and enjoyed college life at a small, though, Christian college. And when that stuff dries up, and even before it does, the idea of politics and opinion and the stuff, again, that's on your podcast, Corey, it's kind of appealing, especially then. And then in coming to DC, my mentor said, the first year after college is the most important year of your life, really, because you're setting all your habits for the first time. There's no parents around. There's no school around. There's no roommates around. It's just you. You can either step it up or not. So I read and read and read. We all have those, what do they call them, Damascus Road experiences, where you just kind of come alive in reading. And I really enjoyed that for a couple of years in DC right out of college.
And look, it served you well. You could still work neo-Calvinist into a sentence. I know I'm out of my league when somebody could do that.
Nerd alert.
Yeah. So, but you did mention Kern Family Foundation, but I'm curious about every stop along the way, AEI, the Ethics Public Policy Center, where you're kind of, you had 2 different stints there. This is technically your second stint there?
Right. It's a boomerang.
Yeah. So it's always been a focus of yours, this intersection. Do you want to describe maybe your experience at the first go around at EPPC and then AEI? It'd be nice to just hear a little bit more about your other experiences.
Sure. That's really generous. Both kind of neoconservative places, mugged by reality was the idea, and deep ideas that even if they're misunderstood in society broadly, ideally they're true. And so reading scholars that kind of go deep around some of those ideas. I worked for actually one of our upcoming forum speakers, Elliot Abrams, who's mostly worked in the national security space and in the State Department over his 4 plus decade career in DC. And when he was president of UPBC on a foreign policy studies and Jewish studies project, then worked at a smaller Christian think tank called the Center for Public Justice in Annapolis, Maryland, that was very interested in welfare reform and school choice and promoting the idea of charitable choice when that was sort of just emerging in the late 90s. And then at AEI, we got to basically, with a team, work with Christian colleges around the country and help faculty network, faculty members of political science and economics and history departments work together and share books and resources, and also sort of welcome in students to a number of conferences, either on those campuses or back here in DC, and have quarterly events on some of these themes as well. So it's just nice to swim with others who are smarter than you. You know, that's the great thing about a think tank, and grow as a result. And, you know, they say normally if you're on the left and you are voted out of office, you go work at the Woodrow Wilson School or the Kennedy School. But if you're on the right, and you're voted out of office, you go work at a think tank because, you know, you're not going to teach it. Maybe there's some schools, but, you know, that was the norm here. And so they're a great area, place to come. I would say if you're listening to this podcast and you are interested at all in the idea of coming to Washington, D.C. or Christianity politics, religion and politics, think tanks in general, come on. There are ways to get plugged in. There are, especially post-COVID, you know, incredible opportunities to work on the Hill, but also to think about working at a think tank and doing some writing, or maybe working at a journalism outlet where you can do a lot of good.
Wow. It never occurred to me to even ask that question. Like, how does one end up at a thing? I just assumed, you go to an Ivy League school and, you know, do your dissertation post-grad in some, you know, the Christianity of Marxism or something, like, you know, some weird, like, abstract, but, and then you end up at, I don't know, the Heritage Foundation or one of I never thought, like, how do people end up there? And I guess you just apply, you get involved and you apply. And so that's interesting. So there's an event coming up in April. It looked really, really interesting. I mentioned a couple times here, but can you tell us a little bit about the forum coming up in April in Miami? Sure.
It's essentially, you know, our classic forum is to go away for 2 days, to get away from New York, get away from DC, retreat, breathe deeply. We put guests up in a nice hotel and allow them to rest. And we have 3 topics each time. And this time, one will be on sort of the reality of the mix of racial unrest and polarization and feedback loops and tech. And then, like, the possibility of actually, you know, theological hope in that reality, which is kind of like what we're really wrestling with. And that's Dr. Jonathan Walton, the chaplain at Wake Forest and the dean there, former preacher at Harvard Memorial Church, and then also David Gergen, who's advised a number of presidents over the years. And it's a gem. Has a new book coming out in May called Hearts Touched with Fire. It's quite good. And then we'll have one on masculinity in the evangelical church called Jesus and John Wayne with Kristen Dumais, as you mentioned, and also Walter Kim, the new president of the National Association of Evangelicals. And then we'll have one also on the future of Judaism, Jewish religion, Jewish population, people making Aliyah, sort of numbers where they're going, with the director of religion research at Pew, Alan Cooperman, and Elliot Abrams. So, and we always put them up afterwards, a week afterwards. We do a transcript and make the video available for people who are interested in broadening the circle. Yeah, it's good stuff. It really is. I watched a couple of the videos there was one that I watched from the recent one you did in Europe, a couple great panels, really engaging stuff, really thought-provoking, robust, nuanced conversations, makes you think about really important current events and important ideas that are influencing our culture. So it's very, very helpful. The content is great. Do you have any questions for me? Oh, man. I mean, you're on the left coast, Corey. And so I guess I wonder a little bit, like, not how bad is it, but, like, you know, your view of this thing you're talking about here, about sort of different Americas, pockets that have sort of very different realities. You know, you might be in church and there's nobody wearing a mask, and then you get to a meeting at the State House and everybody's wearing a mask. Why? Basically, I'm curious about, you know, the David French basic thesis. I don't know if you've had him on your podcast yet or not.
He's one of my goals.
Okay, we'll try to help. Well, he's got this idea that, like, you know, the sort of ingredients for a civil war. We hope not. We don't think so. But, contiguous, land groups where people begin to really believe increasingly sort of very different things from one another. And I'm just curious about, particularly in the spaces that we work with, which is religion and journalism, how different do you think are the norms of leading journalists in California that you read on the one hand from, clerics and people in the church on the other?
Well, you're describing the polarization of the worlds that I'm in. So my day, I can be in some boutique agency in Hollywood, and the default assumptions about what's right and wrong and what's happening in America is pretty two-dimensional. Whereas over the weekend, or I'll go to a Bible study at night, not necessarily in the church that we're a part of now, but the church I was a part of for the first decade or so after I became a Christian. And the lens through which they see the world is so different. The assumptions. I said just a couple of days ago, I told a friend of mine who owns one of these creative agencies in Hollywood, I've lost 3 friends to COVID. And he asked me, well, are they, we talk about politics. He and I talk about politics and religion all the time. Well, are they your Trump supporting friends? I said, yeah, it so happens. 2 were just, chest thumping, MAGA hat wearing. One was a little bit more subtle in his support, but they were all, and he said, it's terrible that they died, of course, and I'm sure their families are grieving, but he said, it's hard for me to sympathize, because he didn't know them as human beings, and he didn't have conversations with my other friends who are the MAGA hat wearing friends. So it's hard for him to have a 3-dimensional point of view about who they are as human beings. And the same can be said about my friends at church. That's why I hear these assumptions. It's very 2-dimensional. There's a tendency for my friends in the Hollywood world, as well as my friends in the church world, to generalize, make caricatures out of, and demonize folks that they don't know. So to build bridges, or just at least sinews where folks can get to know each other as human beings,
And I hear that very much as a major theme of this podcast. And I wonder if I can just add one more, if you're willing.
Sure.
Corey, it's just that, you asked about philanthropy earlier, and the billionaire for whom I worked for a season was very convinced that you better spend your money on people who are 30 and below. Because by the time you hit 30 and above, you're not really going to change. I mean, maybe a few people change. And I wonder, I don't know if you know the metrics on your listeners, but do you think, however, with these larger problems of polarization, that people over 30 can change? I mean, do you see signs of hope in this larger conversation about religion and politics?
Far be it for me to question a billionaire, but the real answer is it depends on the person. I think there are some folks who come out of the womb and their mind is made up, but there are other folks who look at David Brooks, man, that dude, if anybody ever earns the right to think that they've settled on the right set of answers, it would be somebody like David Brooks, but that dude's still evolving, and events in the world force one to reconsider one's assumptions. How many of my friends voted Republican their entire lives, and then Donald Trump happened? Now, listen, a lot of folks are doing all kinds of mental acrobatics and twisting and turning to figure out, that, well, he's really a Christian, but he's just kind of no. There are a lot of folks who had the intellectual and ethical integrity to say, you know what? I can open up practically every page of the Bible and it testifies against the words and actions and character of Donald Trump. I have to rethink whether I can vote Republican this time around. So the short answer to your question is it depends on the person and it depends on the circumstances. I think we can all evolve. The second that I think, even in personal things, parenting, you have 2 kids, right?
3. Mm-hmm.
3 kids. How old are your kids?
12, 9, and just turned 7.
And your youngest is a girl, right? And the other two are boys? Yeah.
Boy, girl.
So I'm a little bit ahead of you. Mine are about to be 21, 18, and about to be 17. And literally, like on a daily basis, I have these epiphanies that, man, I had that all wrong. And, I have this tendency to, spend a little bit of time in regret that I had it wrong and I've been doing it wrong. But just was it yesterday, the day before, we were sitting around the dinner table and I got upset about something. So I'm going to share a little personal story. I don't like talking about body hair and bodily fluids at the dinner table. It bothers me. And I've told my family as much. So the subject of body hair came up at the dinner table. I got all upset. And the next day I didn't know what occurred to me, but I thought, man, you got to lighten up, dude. Because me getting upset and making a point about not talking about that stuff at the dinner table is not nearly as important as making a more hospitable place where my kids want to be around the dinner table in the first place. You know what I mean? So this is a really long way around the barn of saying, man, the second I think I have it right, or any of us have it right, and I just turned 50 years old almost exactly 6 months ago, we're all in trouble, man. We're all in trouble. So I'd rather continue evolving and learning. I believe in God, but I ain't God, and that's one of my firmest convictions. So yeah, hopefully we'll continue to walk the walk and evolve in very positive ways.
It's a great word. Well, it's great to stay open, and it's nice to have some bright lights writing great stuff to help us along the way.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you how we can find Faith Angle Forum, more information about you, but more importantly, are there ways that folks can participate or get more involved or perhaps support Faith Angle Forum?
Oh, that's very generous. Well, we have descriptions of some of that at faithangle.org. We're entrepreneurial, so we're always trying to grow. Yeah, I think if you know of a journalist who would be well suited to come to a forum, we'd always welcome trying to do that. Again, there's one in Napa, there's one in Miami, there's one now in Europe, there's one here in DC. So we'd love to have your help in the larger ecosystem that's part of this effort we're trying to build together.
So how can we find you and Faith Angle Forum online or on social or anywhere else that you're...
Oh, that's generous. We've got a Twitter handle, Faith Angle Forum. We've got faithangle.org as our website, where we basically catalog conversations like today's and the forums. We often do a transcript at the request of a number of journalists who prefer old school, right? Prefer to read the actual quotes and use them rather than just watch a video. So an audio as well is available if you work out and you want to hear the really good conversation between Tim Keller that sent that journalist to a church in DC. It must have been pretty good. You can go back and find it on audio. So we have that website that's a main hub. And there are ways to get involved as well. Someday we'll get a dream team of people involved who are also supporters, and sometimes supporters will come to a forum and observe quietly from the side, and then also get the chance to mix with journalists at dinner. So that's a reality sometimes too, but mostly that's our repository, faithangle.org.
Faithangle.org, real easy to find. Great stuff on there, great content. Spend a little bit of time on there. Take it away from Tucker Carlson tonight, or I don't know. You wouldn't say that, but I can. So anyway, it's really great hanging out with you and getting to know more about Faith Angle Forum, getting to know a little bit more about you. I've really enjoyed it.
Treat. Thanks so much, Corey. Thanks for what you're building.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about TP&R. We're easier to recommend than ever. It's politicsandreligion.us. politicsandreligion.us. You can even support our program through the Patreon app on our site. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the and spelled out, A-N-D. politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials at TP and R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us: by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.